Okay, so I'm gonna mix some stuff together into one video here for you guys. Yesterday on waivers, Brandon Davidson's picked up by Montreal by Edmonton. So Edmonton grabs him from Montreal. I don't understand why Davidson was ever traded by Edmonton. I think this is a smart move by the Oilers. It helps their blue line, and he never seemed to me like he really fit into Montreal's plans, anyways. Montreal's whole patchwork defense that they put together at the deadline last year, I didn't understand. And now Streit's gone, Davidson's gone. Anyways, Matt Molson's on waivers today because Scott Wilson has been acquired by the Buffalo Sabres from the Detroit Red Wings. Now, on the right-hand side here, I've got the amount of points that are on the line here. Davidson had 1 point in 13 games. Molson had none. Wilson had none in 17 with Detroit after having none in 3 when he was in Pittsburgh. So Wilson goes to Buffalo as just a support guy to take Molson out. And I'm sure they'd be quite overly enthusiastic if anybody touched Molson. Nobody will. Molson's going to the AHL. And I guess they're looking to upgrade their speed or whatever Buffalo's trying to do. At this point, it's going to be a house cleaning. And when you're house cleaning, you're looking to get younger, faster, and at least give your fans hope for the future. So Wilson's basically just seen as an upgrade over Molson. But none of these moves are earth-shattering. Now, I watched Hockey Central this morning. And I like Hockey Central. I do. I like Darren Millard. I think Darren Millard's a good guy. I like Colby Armstrong. I think he's a good guy as well. And it was Gord Stellick that was there with them as well. And they had some good topics, but here's how their topics went. They talked Maple Leafs, Canucks, then the Maple Leafs, then Montreal, then they talked Maple Leafs some more, and then Ottawa. And then somewhere in there, Calgary, Montreal, and Winnipeg, and Edmonton. I don't have Edmonton on the board. And Edmonton were mentioned as well. And basically they mentioned the third period and how they felt about the third period of the Calgary-Edmonton game. So about 40 minutes into the program, I pulled the plug in and went and found something else to do. This, and again, this is because there are fans inside Toronto that would look at this and say, well, that's fine. But what happens is when you're talking about, and the way they phrased it too made me kind of go, wait, what? The Leafs had a very good game against Vancouver, which they lost. Okay. Or the Vancouver Canucks defeated the Toronto Maple Leafs on Saturday night 2-1 in a sensational game by Jacob Markstrom. Nope. It was Toronto gets 4 points out of 6 on the road trip after beating Calgary and Edmonton. So, and then they talked a bit about the Canucks in their first line, and then they went back to, so how about the Maple Leafs being first overall? That's close. If they had beaten Vancouver and Tampa loses, they would have been first overall. And it's like, wait, what? And then they went into Montreal and their goals that they scored and how things are looking better and Carey Price. And then they went back to Toronto. And they started talking about Austin Matthews. Then they talked about Ottawa. What's Carlson going to get? And then they talked a bit about, I remember Calgary was in there, and there was a little bit more about Montreal, and then they were going back to Toronto again, and that's when I changed the channel. And this is where, and again, I'm not saying this because I don't like Toronto. The perception's always, oh, he hates the Leafs. No, this is a nationwide broadcast. They were even saying by the third time Toronto came up, like, oh, you're sounding like a homer about Toronto. And whether or not they're contenders and how far are they going to go. And is this the year? And it's like, really? You just talked about Toronto. Then you talked about Toronto. And now we're talking about Toronto again? I get the excitement. I do. I understand it. But if you're going to talk about hockey, this is where it's frustrating for fans of other teams. So if you're a fan of an American team and you're watching Sportsnet, or if you're in the States and you're watching ESPN, they're going to talk about Boston, Chicago, the Rangers, the Kings, and there's some other teams, I guess, where, you know, they focus on the big population centers. Detroit, too. I get it. But again, it's sort of like how when you're watching CNN, everything's Donald Trump. There's other things happening in the world. There's other things happening but Toronto. And when people say, well, they're doing it for ratings, but they're not, though. This is a 1 hour program all across Canada. There aren't fans who are going to watch these three very intelligent men talking about hockey who are going to say, well, now that they're not talking about Toronto anymore, I'm going to turn it off. Because as a Canuck fan, I listened to the talk about Toronto and then the Canucks. And they were nice about the Canucks, but they talked about, oh, doing really well. And I thought, well, yeah, they beat Nashville. You're not going to talk about how they beat Nashville? Okay. All right. How about, that they had a decent road trip? No, we're not going to. All right. And then at the same time, you can talk about how they're good, but talk about how hard it is to get ahead in the West and how many good teams are in the West. Put up a stat that shows, just how insanely good the West really is and how whoever misses the playoffs in the West is going to be a damn good team. Those 9th and 10th place teams are going to be very good teams. This is what's frustrating to the rest of Canada. And I don't say this as funny because people are like, oh, it's ratings. Well, no, you're going to talk about them anyways. The idea that, well, you have to talk about them constantly. This is a roundtable discussion. So again, I'm not trying to throw shade at Darren Millard. That's not what I'm trying to do. But this is what gets frustrating. Because it's fine. It's like, all right, well, they're starting with Toronto. Of course, you're starting with Toronto. Okay. Wait, they're following that up with Vancouver and now they're going back to Toronto? All right. Now they're talking about Montreal. They're back in Toronto again? It should be a line of conversation where, you could timestamp it. Put it that way. If timestamps were on that show, this is what it would look like. And you'd have like little snippets and then back to, here's what Toronto did. Here's what Toronto did. So again, when I do videos and I talk about Toronto, everybody's reporting on everything Toronto does. There's nothing I can add to the conversation. They've already talked about Nylander on the fourth line till you blew in the face. They've already talked about how Freddie Anderson's played for the last month. They've talked about Matthews and the points Matthews has put up. They've talked about Marner and his struggling with goal scoring. All of this has been discussed. I don't add anything to it. All I would be doing is saying, all right, well, here you go. And then just watch the hit counter and go, all right, that got a lot of hits. Good. I don't want to be that guy. I don't. And in terms of YouTube channels talking about Toronto, everybody does. So for me, it's not that I intentionally avoid Toronto. It's that I look at Toronto and I go, well, that's been discussed to death. So I'm just going to be repeating whatever Darren Millard or Colby Armstrong or Nick Kyprios or any of them, any of the guys who are on there, Doug McLean, they're all intelligent people. But it's a matter of it's leaf overload. And some of us, there are 30 other teams, and I do my best on here to talk about those other teams. I know there are times where a team might get skipped over. For instance, Chicago, who's not a Canadian team, they're not going to get talked about a lot on here. I absolutely, I'm fine. I can do a video on that. But it's funny to me because people will say, well, you hate this team, rather than the ones that get it will leave a comment on a video saying, can you do a video on, and they'll give me a specific topic to do with the team, and I'll say, yeah, sure. No problem doing that. Yeah, I can do that. That's kind of fun. But when it's just a comment of, oh, you hate him. Oh, okay. Thanks. I don't. In terms of right now, I mean, obviously, Vancouver would be my favorite team in Canada. Ottawa would be second. So I'm destined to not see a Stanley Cup in Canada for one of the teams I cheer for. But after that, it is kind of fluid. I like Calgary. I don't hate Toronto. Which leaves, well, when I think, it's hard not to pull for Winnipeg. So I can say I would pull for Winnipeg ahead of Calgary and Toronto. But it's not that easy. It's not that easy to just look and say, well, where do you put Edmonton? I guess Edmonton probably about equal with Toronto. But again, this moves, this changes. So the idea that the only one that I admit I don't like is Montreal. But Edmonton, it's hard not to pull for them because they're really underachieving right now. It'd be nice to see them get it together. Toronto, they're one of the leaders in the NHL, so they certainly don't need my support. Calgary's kind of an interesting story in the season that they've had, and Smith and whatnot. And the Jets are kind of inspiring right now. If it wasn't for Vegas and that expansion story, Winnipeg would be the story of the year right now. Winnipeg would be getting all the attention. And here's the thing that gets me. When I'm watching a program and they talk about, Toronto, well, they could have been number one in the league. Yeah, how about Winnipeg? How about Winnipeg and their standing in the league? How about the fact that Winnipeg plays in what is arguably the toughest, or at the very least the second toughest division in the NHL, and Toronto doesn't? What about that part of it? There's a lot more to this than just, overall standings, these guys could be number one. Winnipeg is playing against some pretty damn good teams. And they're putting up really good numbers. So that's what frustrates the rest of Canada at times. So hopefully I've explained that well. But again, let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through and you just happened upon my channel. And between now and then, that's it for me for now. I'll be doing videos again later tonight. I got to do of course, we'll review the 4 games that happened today, and we'll do more with that. But again, I hope I've encapsulated better than I did previously Canadian fans and why it can be frustrating to watch nationwide broadcasts where they're talking about Canadian franchises, and it seems like every second conversation is Toronto. It's not resentment because they're great. It's not resentment because they got Austin Matthews and none of the rest of us do. It's, wait, you just talked about them. They're, why don't you talk about Edmonton, Calgary, Winnipeg? Why isn't Winnipeg leading the show? Why aren't we talking about Winnipeg first? Winnipeg should be first based on what happened last night over Ottawa, and yet they lead with Toronto. So you lead with the team that lost on Saturday rather than the team that won on Sunday and is now in a position to make a run at number one overall, just as much as Toronto is. And yet the conversation was, well, can Toronto be number one overall? And I thought, guys, what about Winnipeg? Winnipeg absolutely can be number one overall, but they get kind of pushed aside. They did mention Mark Scheifele is the most underrated star in the NHL, and then they changed the subject to something else. So there you go. Thank you for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.